Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for tonight's conversation, and happy Black Philanthropy Month. I'm Toya Randall, curator and catalyst for Voice Vision Value, Black Women Leading Philanthropy, the only place and space of its kind dedicated to the elevating and celebrating of Black women who make up the largest BIPOC community of professionals in philanthropy today. Voice Vision Value launched in 2020, and today it includes a leadership legacy web series, a bi-monthly newsletter, and professional development opportunities for Black women, as well as special research projects. Two major accomplishments that I'm most proud of from the past year was releasing the soon-to-be published report, Centering Ourselves, which was produced in partnership with Frontline Solutions, and we're going to talk about that later this evening, and securing funding for a book of essays about the leadership impact of Black women across the philanthropic sector. Celebrating this year would not be possible without a beautiful community of Black women across the country who, over the course of 2020 and 2021, dedicated their talent, their strength, their hearts to making this community possible. And there's a graphic that should be going up any moment that will sort of show you the faces and the names of those women who, over the course of the past year and a half, they strategized with me, we cried together, we prayed together, we laughed together, we cussed together, we mourned and sat at times speechless as we watched the hours and days and weeks and months of violence and volatile experiences that made 2020 and 2021 historic times in our country. And so these are some of the women in their Voice Vision Value swag. Many names are noted here. And again, I just want to say thank you, because they really did contribute to making all of this possible. So tonight we're kicking off the anniversary with our Women Crush Wednesday series. And this series of events will feature many of the women that were on the slide just a few moments ago, as well as others who are sort of the thought leaders and sheroes, and many are history makers as they are pushing and moving philanthropy away from a charity model to one that is more equitable, just, and inclusive. And I'm so grateful tonight to kick off this series with one of those women, the Dr. Jessica Barone, who agreed to rock with me on this road. She and Melissa DeShields from Frontline and my co-pilot and co-conspirator, Olivia Tai, had a conversation last summer about documenting the leadership experiences of Black women at a moment in history where we were really being asked to not only lead philanthropy, but lead the country forward. And we believe that it was something that needed to be sort of documented in real time, and sort of capturing the reflections and the experiences, but also what are some of the recommendations that Black women have for the field going forward. So Jessica served as the lead researcher and writer of the Centering Ourselves report. And she was part of a research team that included the legendary Lynetta Gilbert and Bettina Umstead. Both of them could not be with us tonight because they are busy doing all the fantastic things that they do, in addition to contributing to many of the work projects that we're doing at Voice Vision Value and across the sector. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about Jessica before we jump into the conversation. So Dr. Jessica Barone is committed to advancing knowledge, research, and strategies to dismantle systemic barriers to racial and gender equity. She's a trained sociologist and demographer. Her research has been published and awarded across the academic and philanthropic sectors. She's contributed her expertise to publications such as NPR, The Times, Nonprofit Quarterly, and The Guardian. Nominated for the Book of the Year, her book, The Urban Church Imagined, addresses contemporary diversity and inclusion efforts among one of the nation's most preeminent organizational structures, religious congregations. She currently works as senior consultant for Frontline Solutions, a nationally based Black-owned social impact consulting firm. And at Frontline, she leads the DEI and research portfolios. She hails from Los Angeles, California, is a Pisces who loves the water, and she is home tonight with her 7-month-old Labradoodle Benny, who's watching the Olympics and may join us at any moment. But she holds a PhD in sociology from Texas A&M University. So welcome, Jessica, and thank you for making time to kick off tonight's event and series of what Women Crush Wednesday for Voice Vision Value. How are you?
I am well. Thank you so much for having me for the initial kickoff. I'm excited to be here with you. And yes, Benny hopefully will stay watching the Olympics, but we never know. He may come and join us.
Well, he's beautiful and he's welcome to crash and join the conversation if he so chooses. So before we sort of get into talking about the report and some of the key findings, when we had our conversation last summer, you along with Melissa and Olivia and I, we talked about sort of capturing the ways Black women were leading philanthropy in that moment and leaning into equity, and what would be their recommendations for a 21st century philanthropic model through the lens of being more inclusive, equitable, and just. When we chatted yesterday, you said that this was one of the most difficult things you'd ever written. So can you talk a little bit about just sort of the process of putting together the framework for the research, the questions, and sort of why that presented a challenge to you?
Yeah, I think difficult in, not bad difficult, but difficult in that, in part in being a research scientist, you are a steward of information and what you do with that information and how you distribute it and to whom. And I understood, as well as, my research team with Lynetta and Bettina, that, once we kind of got into it, we realized these are very powerful stories, and how do we be good stewards of those stories? And so, I've written dissertations, I've written books, I've written, a lot of different things and other reports, which are just as meaningful. And yet this one has been difficult in that I just want to do a good job. I just want to do a good job for these women who lent their time and their tears and their stories. Because as you stated, we interviewed these women from, October 2020 through February-ish 2021. So during some of the most tumultuous times our country has seen. So we had, the summer of 2020 in a global pandemic, then the election, then all the amazing things that Stacey Abrams and a lot of other women of color were able to pull off, and then the insurrection. I think I was actually interviewing a woman while the insurrection was happening, and we were both kind of like, is there something happening at the Capitol right now? So there was just a lot of emotion throughout this research process that hadn't occurred in other ones that I've been a part of. And then also just, being a Black woman as well. And again, a steward as a scientist wanting to do the best job to get this information across, it has posed to be difficult, just because these women are so brilliant, and I want to make sure that we capture what they're saying, and also understand that these reports aren't meant to capture everything. And if you do a good job as a researcher, then this information will build to more and more things. And so that is the hope, that this is just a catalyst to allow other brilliant writers and researchers to take the charge and find different nuances to go down the line of a new, research agenda.
Yeah, I mean, we had a lot of conversations along the way to getting to now. And I think one of the earlier sort of discoveries that you shared was how the way in which you were developing the report and sort of moving through the research was unlike any other sort of study of Black women in the sector up until this point. So can you talk about what makes this report and this research different?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, there's been a lot of wonderful work and studies, which in the appendix of the report, we outline as much as we could. This particular report is a little unique in that we were able to um, uh, interview the largest sample of Black women who hold kind of a director level or above position. This also occurred in a particular historical moment, which we're able to capture. A lot of women talked about how they leaned on their information and their experience from Katrina. So we were right in the middle of something and able to capture in real time. And then also, so the sample size was the largest, and it was one of the most diverse in terms of age, in terms of tenure within the organization, as well as, and within philanthropy, as well as different types of foundations in which these women were a part of. So that could have been family, private, corporate, religious, so there was a pretty wide range and not necessarily, well, I guess nationally representative. We had women from, if you're into the census, any of the 6 census regions, from the country, we had that represented as well. So it was a pretty large sample. We talked to about 37 women. And at that point, I think the largest sample size had been about 12.
Wow. So I'm going to get to the questions that I sent you and that we talked
That's okay.
about. Listening to you, I'm having some different questions come to mind. Why do you think this type of sort of time and attention given, right, like this sort of large representation of Black women in the sector, particularly there are more Black women CEOs than ever before in the history of professional philanthropy. We have regions of the country like Chicago that has, 15, 16 Black women CEOs. But there's never been sort of a moment to stop, right, and capture this narrative and the impact, given all the different research, activities that have gone on in recent history. Do you have some sense of why that is the case? I think I have my sort of sarcastic response, but you're the researcher here, so.
I mean, sarcasm is always welcome, so Black, but the official reason I think Black women, intersectional oppression, those kinds of things. One thing I do think that is interesting was so many women said, it seems so revolutionary, but it shouldn't be that we're stopping and actually taking time. And I think so many Black women that we interviewed talked about rest and reflection being such a huge part of their lives in this current moment. And I think that's reflected in us taking this time to stop and say, let's actually document this. I think it was important, although it doesn't show up a ton in this report, but it was important for us to ask women, we asked them about their roles and things, but the second question we asked was, how did you get here? Talk to me about the decisions that you made to get into philanthropy and, that kind of stuff, because I think it's important to capture and understand how and why these women have come to the spaces that they're in. Oftentimes we don't stop and reflect, and especially given that there's not a lot of pathways for Black women to get into the field and then to move up. If there is some way to understand if there's a pattern in which Black women are entering into philanthropy and how they get there, maybe we can replicate that and then protect that as a pathway and nurture that all the way through. But I suspect that we don't do a really good job of stopping and reflecting sometimes as well. And I think this also speaks to a lot of the equity in research, that we need more researchers of color to ask these questions and to do this work. So much of the research, not necessarily the research prior on Black women, had been done mostly by other Black women, but a lot of this research that's on, leadership and, profiles and, you know, uh, tactics for elevating leaders, have, been mostly done on white men, white women, men of color. So I think there was an opportunity here, and I'm really glad that you decided to take it.
Well, I'm glad you decided to accept. So there are 7 themes, sort of main takeaways that you sort of highlighted. And so let's talk about some of those. And I know you describe those takeaways in 2 categories. One, centering preservation of self, and you've talked a little bit about well-being as an example. And then the other is around sort of strategies to make the field more equitable, inclusive, and just. So can you share and unpack what some of those themes are? Particularly, let's start with self-preservation.
Yeah, I thought what was so interesting, and when I had to sit back and do some of the analysis and also talking to my research team, I said, does it seem like women are speaking with 2 minds to you? And they were like, yes, we were trying to figure that out. And it was very much, we had women who were talking and having 2 simultaneous conversations with us. One about kind of like the sister girl conversation, real intimate about what we need to do and the collective we. And then another one about, very kind of sophisticated and tactical approaches to their leadership, to how the field needs to change. What does the vehicle of philanthropy mean? How can we democratize philanthropy? And then even some really, really innovative theoretical ways to kind of think about the future and the function of philanthropy. So I was just so impressed with the way in which women were able to have these conversations at the same time. But I think that speaks to, right, just the lived experience of Black women having to protect themselves because there's not a lot of protection for them, and then also charged with advancing the field. And so these things were happening kind of at the same time, these conversations. So the first one, in terms of every single person we interviewed up and down talked about self-care, and self-care as, the Audre Lorde revolution type of self-care, not so much like, the mani-pedi on a Saturday, which, I'm all for, but it was very strategic, right? They talked a lot about the loneliness and the burnout of being in these positions and being, quote unquote, the only, right? You mentioned in Chicago, there's kind of like a saturation, right, of these Black women, but for the most part, there isn't across the nation. And so there's not that person that they could really go to. And so they talked a lot about putting wellness into their job descriptions and having this structure for wellness, right? So making sure there's sabbaticals, that their therapy is covered, coaches, you name it. And I thought it was interesting because they kept talking about as a wellness strategy. So not kind of this elective thing that they were doing, but really formalizing it within their organization as a strategy. And then especially with everything that was happening with COVID, and we know that Black women in particular are among such of the populations that are experiencing some of the worst outcomes. They really had to change the way that they led these other women who they were in charge of within the organization. As we know, a lot of philanthropic organizations are, tilting more towards women, and these women are carrying a lot. So this idea of also then investing in decolonizing their own leadership strategies, which was something that I thought was so interesting in a conversation, they had in thinking about, as the rest of the world is wrestling with things, we now need to stop and ask ourselves, are we having these complex conversations with ourselves? Are we talking about the colorism and the classism that exists amongst ourselves? Are we talking about how some of us have reproduced these very white dominant and white supremacist ways of leading? How do we lead from the way that we need to? And so that was really, really fascinating, just hearing them walking through those particular types of discussions. And, one woman talked about, which stuck out to me so much, she said, every time I see on Facebook, one of the women in my network talk about, oh, go get your mammogram, make sure you go get your physical. She said, I knew something was behind that. So it wasn't just like a PSA, but we had in some way failed that woman to take care of herself earlier and sooner. So how do we continue to do that? And so the ways that they talked about networking was so different from the ways, if you study any kind of like leadership theory or business school, even as a sociologist, network analysis, right? It is not the way in which Black women are thinking about it. They're thinking about networking as this is a group, kind of like this chair, like a strand that we are all together and we are together for life. And so this isn't, my work phone and then my personal phone, all these numbers are in the phone together and we do this work together. And that is a distinctively different way to think about networking and something that is under theorized and understudied, but has kept afloat a huge swath of the field, i.e. Black women that have really pushed this field forward. And so we are remiss if we do not study this innovative, ingenious way of thinking about networking.
Absolutely. And I think, how the unique ways in which we network and sort of create community for ourselves is definitely something that has helped sustain me to still be in philanthropy 20 plus years. But I didn't necessarily discover that as a strategy until like 5-6 years in, and there was a lot of harm and a lot of hurt that occurred in those earlier years of my career. And so I think it's interesting that we're now we have an opportunity to have this conversation, sort of build in an intentional sort of strategy around creating networks that facilitate holistic development, both the personal and the professional, and then the communal, right? Sort of safeguarding and safe space making. Mm-hmm. And so I will be interested to sort of think through and have conversations about, right, like how do we sort of build that in more intentionally as we prepare at some point post Delta variant to go back out into the world and the sort of the hustle and bustle of life as we have come to know it. And so there was another piece that you talked about when we were preparing for this conversation that resonated with me, and it was around how Black women are beginning to formalize roles and be really strategic about the titles and the sort of descriptors of their work as a way of creating, leadership pathways for those coming up the line. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, something that we noticed too, when we were going through our interview analysis was that a lot of these women, we'd ask them, what is your role? And they'd say it, and then they say, well, then this too, and this too, and then I created this. And so many women had created an additional role. And many of those roles were to solidify a certain type of work that once they exited, someone else could come along and fill. And so they were in essence, creating their own pathways and protecting those. As many said, those pathways aren't protected. And typically when you see one Black woman put in a position, she is then overworked and then has burnout, and then she's replaced by a white person. And so there's not this kind of consistent and consecutive way to support the evolution of Black women's leadership throughout an organization, much less having Black women move up in one organization all the way to the top. And so these Black women were innovative and genius enough to basically create and carve out, these pathways, kind of like, I think about like the cartel and their little tunnels. I was like, these are these, cartel tunnels to make sure that we have a place to go and to stay and to thrive. And it is super genius. And the downside to that is that these women are carrying and doing 5 jobs instead of just one. But it is in the preservation of these women they've never met that will hopefully
Mhm.
get into these positions and have a place and a space within the field.
Yeah. So your last point moves us into the strategies and recommendations for the field.
Mhm.
And right, like the layering of responsibilities and roles that we carry, because we're picking up on sort of um, the needs of institutions that they didn't know existed. And so we're sort of honing in on some of those needs and creating opportunities for ourselves to lead organizations through various situations. But the issue of pay equity, right, was one of the sort of big themes. As we've said, folks have multiple titles, but aren't necessarily being paid for the
They don't get
weight
multiple
that
checks.
they don't get multiple checks.
No
So,
multiple checks.
and this is not unique to philanthropy, right?
Sure.
The Biz Foundation released a report a couple years ago that sort of laid bare not only the inequities of investment in Black-led and people of color-led organizations, but the inequities in pay. And I think there was recently a piece in the Washington Post sort of lifting up this similar narrative for a DC-based foundation. So talk about what some of the takeaways were from the women who were interviewed as it relates to pay equity.
Yeah, I mean, pay equity came up in some of the most disturbing ways. A lot of women talked about the ways in which, they obviously were not paid the same as the white men who preceded them. One thing that I thought was so fascinating was I don't think, and I'll have to double check, but I am almost 99% sure none of these women had a predecessor that was a Black woman. And so they are coming, and most of them were white men. And so quite a few women talked about, unfortunately so, how they had to purchase their own kind of salary information because the board would not give it to them as to what they paid the previous person. And then they'd had to negotiate every single year their own salary and continue to renegotiate. So you have that kind of wall. And so many Black women talked about pay equity and board education and readiness as the two kind of ways in which we can make some of the most distinctive changes for Black women to kind of blossom and really bloom as the leaders that they are. And when you think about boards, not having your board chair kind of lockstep with you can create such a difficult situation that is almost insurmountable. And that's so much wasted energy that could be somewhere else. And so, in ways that some of these Black women were talking about board readiness, one Black woman has started racial caucusing amongst her board. So, letting all the white board members deal amongst themselves and talk to themselves. Another woman, they've piloted they invested in a pilot to develop a power cohort that is kind of explicitly for white people to go kind of on a retreat on their own and deal with their whiteness with white consultants and white trainers. And so there's some movement in the ways in which Black women are kind of spearheading how this is going to look and how we are going to change this. And one suggestion that we're thinking about, from this report is developing some type of board curriculum and board readiness for not dealing because they need to deal with themselves, but how they are dealing with Black women and how they are supporting, how they can support, and just understanding, philanthropy can't move without Black women. And so you are only standing in your own way and not helping and supporting these women reach their highest capacity. And so I think another way that was really interesting was Black women talked about really trying to position other Black women in operations position, and operations as kind of the hired hand and the assassin in like the equity game. If you have a really dope operations person, that can really shift the tide for a lot of hires, a lot of programs, a lot of practices and policies that you're trying to integrate. So there were some really interesting and unique ways in which Black women were dealing with that, specifically internally, and then externally really moving the field right away from this charity narrative into a structural narrative, understanding that structure often means retrenchment. And so having to be very skilled at talking about the ways in which structural change is what we really need to be going after. And then you had, women who are more on the kind of liberation side of things, talking about, switching up the language from, charity to really talking about, reparations for the oppressive system that has hoarded and maintained white wealth, right? So there was also, I think, throughout our conversations, because of the large sample size, we had different generational approaches, right, to equity. We had folks who were more on the side of, use what we have and keep pushing, and other folks burn it all down and we can create something different, and everybody in between. And so those were really fascinating conversations to see where the intersections were. I thought, though, something that I really haven't seen in other reports and things that I've done, where there's an intergenerational divide or a class divide or what have you. Many of these women talked about how they love these networks so much because there wasn't competition. And so they can come, and maybe there is some pushback, but they can at least come and still be their full and whole selves. And I think, as they all said, there's room to grow in terms of, women from working class backgrounds, being elevated just as much, and women who are not femme presenting, being elevated as much. And women still felt like they can have these conversations, and there wasn't kind of this old guard, new guard, or changing of the guard, but that, the OGs, as I like to call them, from LA. So an OG is like, that is the biggest sign of, respect. Having those women come alongside and learn from these younger women and vice versa is something, again, I think is under theorized and understudied, and something that we really have to look at as a unique strategy.
Absolutely.
To the way in which Black women lead.
Absolutely. And so, I do know, when I think of, sometimes I'm called an OG, but then there are the other OGs. Like, and I hope I don't get in trouble, like the Lynettas and
Right.
the Gladys Washingtons, right? Who are really supportive and sort of holding space for us and helping to guide and inform and be thought partners and co-conspirators. But they also speak to the uniqueness of this moment, and that a moment like now didn't necessarily occur during their careers. And how do we really seize the moment and sustain momentum in a way that really does shift and push the field in ways that are in furtherance of, reparations, Black liberation, right? Sort of investing in organizations in ways that are absent the paternalistic practices, the extractive sort of exercises and labor intensive applications and reporting and site visits, right? Like all the things that the field sort of let go in the crisis moments that occurred in 2020 and into 2021. Was there any discussion around how do we continue to hold the feet to the fire, right? And so philanthropy is very fickle, and we turn the page and there's some new flavor of the month. How do we hold ourselves in this pattern of continue to move in a trust-based way, continue to move in a way that is resourcing Black and Brown-led, people of color-led institutions like never before, right? Did the women describe how they are thinking about holding the line beyond the movement moment, as many have described this as being?
Yeah, I was super impressed that, Black women have such a unique power analysis. And this is something we found. We did a study about women of color's political power, and just the sophisticated and tactical ways in which Black women talked about what we can think about moving forward, right? So there was even some larger theoretical conversations, as I said before, about the function and the future of philanthropy, but a few things that women had lifted up was, we have democratic structures that have weakened, right? And we have a year or two now that have been really, really bad, right? So the things that we can think about is we have strategically changed human behavior in that mutual aid funds were like something that we just did quickly that didn't happen before, right? We are getting things out the door. We are getting money out the door. We are moving faster and in a less cumbersome way. So how do we then continue to hold that? And holding that is then putting equity into the values as these leaders, into the strategic plans and into the mission statements explicitly, so that that language, it is visible in there, so you can always point back to as an accountability structure. Also, quite a few women who are very, I kept saying they need to be in somebody's cabinet because they had such a elevated way of talking about the economic structure, and the financial structure that is philanthropy. And so thinking about foundations as actual hedge funds, right? And so you're so concerned with what 5% of your funds are doing, but really 95% is doing something totally different. And that 95% really matters. And so how do you have successful stewardship of an organization with so much financial might and so little accountability? And so really starting to have those conversations about deconstructing the ways in which we understand that 5%. And yes, we are only responsible for that. However, that cannot prevent us from having an outsized impact, right, within the field. And so there were so many of those kind of theoretical conversations, as well as understanding, Black organizations are just disappearing, right, full stop, because of COVID. And that was because of a lack of capital. So when we start thinking again in this structural mindset and this reparations mindset, we can start thinking about moving capital. And so those are the conversations that Black women are championing and shifting, and seeing a lot of then this wave, right, of impact investing, of investors, of this whole kind of financial conversation that was very much left out of the ways in which folks interacted with Black women, right? It's like, oh, you do the community stuff over here, we'll take care of the money over here, as if those weren't two in the same. And a lot of Black women have talked about thinking, about community and economic change, and we're thinking about it in a racial lens, and folks hadn't before. So bringing that racial lens to it is a way to continue that vehicle moving forward. And so that's, a lot of Black women discuss that, as well as just, so many said, I used what I found and knew what happened in Katrina for now. And so I'm going to take what happens here for the next crisis, for the next what have you. And we can't be as ill prepared as we were for Katrina, and we have to move just as fast as we did for COVID. So there is a crisis footprint that Black women have jotted down and kept, so that they can have that blueprint for the next X, Y, and Z. But I think the opportunity, again, is that, these years have been so bad, people are willing to walk away from what they knew before and create an opportunity and a space for us to walk through. And we are well equipped to walk through as Black women, again, because of these footprints from other types of crises that we've been in. And so that is the opportunity that a lot of Black women are holding on to.
Yeah. So are there other themes that we didn't touch on? I'm looking here. I'm particularly interested in the simultaneous conversations, right? Especially the sister girl conversation and talk. And so were there other parts of those conversations that you'd like to share with the audience, or did we cover it pretty well?
I think just in general too, Black women have a sense of openness to their leadership that, again, is under theorized and understudied. When you think about leadership, an ambition to be a leader, right? So many of these Black women would fall out of that category, right? People want to lead because they feel like they're natural born leaders and they're meant to lead. And we have this whole lexicon around leadership that is ill-fitting for the type of leadership that Black women step into and really have created and designed. And so much of that Sister Girl conversation was speaking to that leadership that no one else is speaking to, and speaking life into those approaches and those ways of thinking and those ways of leading that are in many ways antithetical to how we think about leadership. And so I thought that was so fascinating. You know, there's been so much work on the charismatic leader and the servant leader and the types of leadership. They typically have a very either misogynistic lens or religious bend to them, white, right, like boss lady, like, you know, what was that? I forget, leaning in, you know, and that kind of stuff. Things are inadequate to capture the unique ways in which Black women have developed their own ways of leadership because of the intersections of race and gender and how those operate within this country. So there was so much willingness to, again, like I said, address their own decolonization, their own isms, right, within the ways in which they understood. And I think that, again, that is not, you know, that type of vulnerability and that type of exposure and that type of honesty is not something that we see lifted up as a type of leadership that is ideal, but one for these women that has sustained them, and I think will sustain a lot of us, and we'll see a very different kind of organizational structure if we lean into this type and cultivate this type of leadership. So those are, I think, again, like I said, the willingness to talk about the class dynamics, the colorism, right? Like those different taboo topics that they're not afraid to wrestle with, intergroup dynamics, you know, age cohorts and things like that are so important to them and how they want to advance their own leadership styles. And yeah, again, I just think that that is such a fascinating finding and something that we really, really need to press into more.
Yeah, and I think it's also interesting in that it is clear that we recognize the unique leadership sort of characteristics and qualities that we bring into various spaces. But then there's also this tension around the imposter syndrome, right? And how do we sort of address that in a way that further strengthens our own confidence and sort of comfort in the unique, creative, innovative ways in which, because of our lived experience and where we sit at the intersection of race, class, gender, right, that we are bringing a very well understood and well lived worldview into these spaces, which sets us apart from our white counterparts. But the imposter syndrome is something that often comes up, whether it's women who, you know, have PhDs, master's degrees, 25 years of experience. It's still that little thing nagging at all of us at any given moment.
Yeah, so many women talked about that because they are the only, that language of the only. And then so you're feeling like an imposter, but part of you feeling like an imposter is because you're trying to fit into and contort into a style of leadership that is not the style that is, you know, kind of innate to Black women. And so so many Black women talked about the need for a fellowship, for some type of cohort of women. You know, there's so many to kind of get folks up the ladder, but then when you get to the top of the ladder, it kind of stops. So what are the ways that we continue to support Black women throughout the, you know, their tenure as then board members, as trustees, right? So throughout the life cycle of their leadership and philanthropy.
All right, excellent. Well, we want to invite any of the folks in the audience who might have questions to put them in the chat. I've got a couple more for Jessica, but can pause if folks out there want to chime in or ask questions about the report or about any of the sort of interview, the process or the interview subjects. But while we wait for questions, you talked about how the team conducted these interviews between October 2020 and February 2021. So sort of coming out of the racial reckoning of summer 2020, leading into the presidential election that resulted in a political crisis that ushered in the January insurrection. And so wellness was a theme for the women you all interviewed. How did you, as the person sort of holding these stories and experience, extend grace and compassion to yourself through this experience of developing the report in the backdrop of all that came undone and continues to be undone as we sit here tonight?
Yeah, I've been trained in qualitative methods, and as a qualitative researcher, you are the tool of measurement. So you are the one that is examining and watching people's body language and paying attention to the words they say and that kind of stuff. And so you have to understand your thresholds and your own boundaries with how much you can take. And that is why I try to always have, a research team, or at least folks that, we can bounce ideas off of each other, because nothing should ever be done alone. Science is not done alone. Science is not objective. It is subjective, and you just have to know the limitations of what you are doing and what you can say and what you can't say in terms of, how far the data stretches. So I think having that team was helpful, so we could kind of either commiserate with each other or say, did you feel that too? Or did you hear that? Did you see that? So that was something that was really big, was to lean on my technical training, because this is a moment unlike any other. And so there were definitely times I went way back into my old training and had to pull out some, tips and tricks for holding these. And one of my favorite professors and former professors told me when I was actually writing my book, because I had so many interviews and you just can't put it all even in the book length. And she said, you just have to take those stories and you have to give them back to the universe and thank them for their time, and understand that even if you don't address them specifically, they are still a part of this larger fabric. And so there was a lot of that, of understanding there were so many great tidbits of what these women said, but it can't all fit in this one report. However, they are still woven into the fabric of that. And so constantly reminding myself that that is, a part of that process. But it is taxing. People talk about the rigor of quantitative data, which I do as well, quantitative research, but qualitative research takes way more out of you. And it takes a lot of skill and self-awareness to kind of be able to step back. And you're still human. I mean, I still had times where I was like, I'm too overwhelmed. I can't do this. I can't think about it. I can't read it. It's, it's a lot to process and take in.
Absolutely. Well, I appreciate so much the care with which you sort of carry this this project. And when you sent the first draft, I told you this, so I'm going to share it with the folks watching. I was so excited that I didn't want to open it. And I felt, it was like, for the first time, I felt like my 14-year-old self when the boy I liked at Hughes Quinn Junior High called, and we had caller ID, and I could see it was his nickname was Juice. And I could see it was him calling, and like the anticipation, like, answer it. No, I'm not ready. Answer it. No. And that's how I felt when your email popped in my inbox with the first draft. And so it has come together so beautifully, but it also sort of spoke to the need for more, right? Like, I'm not following the advice of your professor and like, just let the stories go into the universe. And Instead, borrowing from another one of the things you share with me, I think we need another boat. That line from, I think you said it's from Jaws.
Yeah, Jaws, one of my favorite movies, and it's one of the most iconic lines. And he's like, "I think we're going to need a bigger boat."
Yeah, I think we're going to need a bigger boat to really do justice to the breadth and depth of contribution Black women have made to this sector, not just over the past year and a half, but sort of over a longer stretch of time, but also and be inclusive of a larger sort of community of voices. So, when we were debriefing with you and Nadia earlier this spring, and it's like, oh, we could do this, we could do this, we could do that. I think we need to create a series of reports so that we can build, continue to build and continue to, as you said, right, sort of drive this push for more research, more discovery, more understanding, and more documentation of the unique leadership strategies and experiences and pathways that Black women have carved out for ourselves, and for those coming alongside of us. So with that in mind, you've not committed to anything. But in thinking about, the next iteration of research, what are your thoughts? Like, where would you recommend Voice Vision Value go, on the next leg of this journey?
Yeah, I think as a researcher, your biggest goal and hope is that folks would find your research relevant enough to then build off of it, right? Whether they critique the hell out of it or they find a unique line and that is spurs on their own leg of research. So it is exciting to think that, folks could find this useful and go to another stream. I would think about, this kind of intergroup conversation, right? About, the isms, the classism, the, different ways to think about approaches to leadership, right? Liberation versus X, Y, and Z, or not even versus, but a spectrum, right, of those different approaches. So that intergroup conversation, that decolonizing, that kind of, again, that speaks to the intimacy that Black women that allow folks into, I think is really important. And then I think just this overarching, if we reimagined what we knew about leadership, how would we then see what Black women are doing and the genius of what they are doing? Those are some places that I would definitely start, because I found it so fascinating in that, we will completely miss the ambitions, the, war strategies of Black women if we think about leadership in a certain frame. If we think about networking, we'll completely miss the ways in which Black women are using networks. So it's kind of pulling apart and interrogating a little bit more some of those nuances that were lifted up in the ways in which Black women lead and think about leadership.
Awesome. Well, thank you for, again, the care and commitment and deep respect that you brought to this project. Thanks to Lynetta and Bettina for partnering with you in bringing this to fruition. The report will be released later this month to the public as we put the finishing touches on it, but I really thought it important to bring you into this celebration because it is, I think, a historic contribution that you've made, and I can't thank you enough for your heart and for your spirit and for your overall just beautiful way in which you held this so dear to you. So thank you. Thank you so much.
No, thank you for the opportunity. It is something I didn't know I needed in that moment too. And I think it's important for researchers and scientists to say that we are human. We need these stories too. And it's not just this kind of, wall between us. I value these women who I've never met before, but will always hold dear. And so I just thank you for letting myself and Frontline and Bettina and Lynetta be a part of this process.
Well, you are welcome. Thank you, thank you, thank you. So to all of you who took out time to join us tonight, thank you. We'll be back next Wednesday with another conversation featuring a community of women who created new organizations and philanthropic endeavors over the past year. Carmen James Randolph, one of the founding 5 for the Women's Foundation of the South. Sierra Coleman, who launched a giving circle. Tynesha McHarris is going to moderate. She is one of the co-founders of the Black Feminist Fund. And then we have Dr. Rhonda Bryant, who launched the Nafasi Fund, a Black-led infrastructure organization. So that's going to be next Wednesday night at 6 o'clock Central Time. So go to voicevisionvalue.org to register and then see the 2 following conversations that will be happening on August 18th and August 25th. Thank you again, Jessica. Thank you, Frontline, for always being a willing and ready partner to answer the call in the myriad of ways that Marcus and Micah and all the folks over there, Melissa, do so beautifully and brilliantly. So good night, everyone, and we will see you next week. Bye-bye.
Bye, thank you.